Hi, this is Sam Weigel with V1 Rotate, and this week we're going to talk about the ups and downs of owning your own aircraft for training and time building. As the owner of 2 airplanes and a member of 2 flying clubs before that, I've experienced a lot of the positives of aircraft ownership. I've often said that if I was starting over from scratch and building my flying career all over again, I'd buy myself an airplane to train in and build flight time. Of course, when I was actually starting off my career, aircraft ownership was well out of financial reach. A lot of my perspective on aircraft ownership today is through the prism of my current financial situation, which, as a major airline captain, is a lot different than when I was starting out as a kid from a non-aviation, lower middle-class family of 8. Back in September of 2022, I wrote a V1 Rotate piece about some of the positives and negatives of aircraft ownership for training and time building. If you haven't read it, I'd suggest you do so. Due to space constraints, I did talk about how my first ownership experience ended. I think it's a story that's worth telling because it very amply demonstrates the inherent risk of ownership, which is something you need to consider before committing to that path. In 2014, as a junior FO at my current airline, I bought a 1953 Piper Pacer, a 4-seat classic taildragger that's pretty similar to my current Stinson 108. I had belonged to several flying clubs before this, with a Cessna 170 and a Piper J3 Cub, but my wife Dawn and I had decided that our planned flying adventures called for an airplane of our own. I bought Pacer 3323 Alpha, Kalispell, Montana, from a guy that had owned her for 8 years. He flew her a lot at the beginning and had made some great upgrades, but she hadn't flown a lot over the last couple of years, which probably should have been a red flag. I had a pre-buy inspection done by a local mechanic and he said it was good, but I wasn't present for the inspection and honestly didn't really know the right questions to ask. Over the next 18 months, we flew that airplane everywhere. I brought it back from Montana with the help of famed goose slayer Jeff Skiles, took it from Minnesota to the Bahamas and back, raced it in the AirVenture Cup, and bombed around the dirt strips of Mexico's Baja Peninsula. Don and I loved our Pacer. Owning it was a great adventure. And yet, our ownership coincided with a pretty major change in the direction of our lives. In August 2015, Don and I decided to sell our home and just about everything we owned, buy a sailboat, and sail down to the Caribbean for a few years. In fact, in a pretty crazy coincidence, on our Pacer trip to the Bahamas, we flew right over our future boat, Windbird, anchored in what would become one of our favorite cruising grounds. Even once we made the decision to transition to boat life, I considered keeping the plane, but soon decided, quite correctly as it turned out, that we wouldn't have the time or money to use and maintain an airplane and a cruising sailboat at the same time. We decided to take the plane on a farewell tour around the perimeter of the US and then up to Alaska, where we would sell it to someone who would use our little bush plane wannabe the way she deserved to be used. The Pacer's annual was due at the end of April 2016, so over my birthday weekend, we flew from Torrance, California to Vancouver, Washington, where I left the plane at Pearson Field to have aero maintenance do the annual. I had a Portland overnight for work a few days later, and since the plane wasn't in the shop yet, I took my friend Duncan and his 2 young sons for a scenic flight. We flew around Mount St. Helens, over the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, down the Columbia River Gorge, and over Duncan's house in West Portland. There were a lot of places that weren't really landable, so I kept a close eye on the engine instruments, and they stayed rock steady for all 90 minutes of the flight. The plane went in the shop the next day, and I had just landed back in Minneapolis when I got a call from the mechanic. They had found metal in my oil, a lot of metal, about a tablespoon. Now, I had just changed the oil in SoCal, and as always, I took a magnet to the oil screen since this engine didn't have a spin-on filter. The oil was clean then. I told the mechanic to start exploratory surgery and didn't have to go far. When he dropped the oil pan, he found nearly an inch-long piece of main bearing. At some point in those last 90 minutes, as I traversed some very rough terrain with my friend and his boys, my hitherto faithful engine was tearing itself apart. We had been lucky, very lucky. Of course, I didn't completely see it that way at the time, because I now had an old airplane with a junk engine right at the time we were about to sell her. Don and I talked over our options, build overhaul, used motor, crate engine, but none of them made financial sense unless we kept the airplane. Reluctantly, I sold 2-3 Alpha as is, where is, and to my knowledge, she has not flown since. Back in 2014, I had bought the Pacer for $22,000 and 2 years later sold it for $10,000. Today, the price of aircraft has increased considerably. I'm guessing a recurrence of my experience would cost 20 grand or more. Thinking back to the years when I was training in time building, I did not have 20 grand to lose. Such a financial setback might have killed my career before it even got started. Now, you might say, Sam, you should have been more careful about the plane you bought. You shouldn't have considered one that hadn't been flying much, and you should have been more involved in the pre-buy. You should have insisted on more scoping the engine. You're not wrong. All that is true. And if you know that much as someone just starting their flying career, good on you. Maybe aircraft ownership is for you. But it is also true that apparently good airplanes sometimes don't make the TBO or have very expensive annuals or get damaged in ways that insurance companies balk at covering. There is a certain amount of risk that comes with aircraft ownership, and depending on your financial situation, monetary risk could also be career risk. Now, with that risk, most certainly comes a reward. Barring unexpected maintenance surprises, ownership is usually cheaper than renting. Aircraft availability ceases to be an issue. You gain the ability to use an independent CFI. You gain the flexibility to make neat cross countries to interesting places. And you get to land at cool airports, like all the grass strips around here where landing is prohibited by most of the flight schools in the area. That's not nothing. Learning to fly, getting your advanced ratings, and time building can be a serious grind, and it does burn some people out before their career has even begun. I think that's tragic. There's so much fun and enjoyment to be had in flying, even in training to fly professionally, if you make the effort to find it. Yes, aircraft ownership does involve risk, but it also brings a pretty serious reward, turning the start of your career into a great adventure. Thanks for watching V1 Rotate, and for more great content for new and aspiring professional pilots, join me here at flymag.com every first and third Friday of the month.